Dr. Raymond Moody, and thank you so much for joining me at the University of Heaven. Since 1965, I have had the great honor and privilege of being able to interview literally thousands of people from all around the world with near-death experiences. And of course, everybody listening to this, I'm sure by now knows the story, but basically people all over the world have very similar experiences when they are revived after cardiac arrest. We have all heard, for example, that when people say their heart stops beating, they feel that they leave their physical bodies and they watch the scene of the resuscitation from up above. And no matter how articulate they are, at some point they enter into a state of consciousness that they say they just can't describe, an experience beyond words. And in terms of what they try to use the words to say, is they tell us that they feel that they go through a passageway of some sort, which they may describe as a tunnel. And they come out on the other side of that light, of that tunnel, into an incredibly brilliant and comforting and loving light. And in that light, they say that relatives or friends of theirs who've already died seem to be there almost in the role of a greeting committee to help them through this transition. And most interesting, they say they see a panoramic review of every single thing they've ever done in their lives, but from the point of view, usually, of the people with whom they've interacted. So in this panorama, if you see an unkind action that you did, then when that action has its result, you are empathically embedded in the consciousness of the person that you hurt. So you feel the feelings directly. Or if you see yourself doing a kind-hearted or loving action, you feel that the good feelings that you brought about. So when people come back from this, they are profoundly transformed. They say they have no more fear of death because they learn from their experience that what we call death is a transition into another realm of reality. And whatever they had been chasing before, knowledge as myself, or power or fame or money or any of these other things, they come back from this saying that what this life is all about is learning to love. And I will say this too, that people say it doesn't make it any easier. As I like to say, it's very difficult to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person, right? And that's people say you're still like that, but you have this vision of the importance of love, but it's very difficult to put it into practice. So I learned about these experiences in 1962 when I was an 18-year-old student of philosophy at the University of Virginia. And I read Plato's Republic, which is really about a near-death experience. And I was interested in this because as a kid, having no religious background, I mean, that idea was not in the cards for me. But Plato was the first person I ever heard the idea of an afterlife from who took it seriously. I thought it was a joke. So I was intrigued by this, and I asked my professor, Lewis Hammond was his name. I said, what is this about Plato says there's this man who almost died? And Professor Hammond said, yeah, these early Greek philosophers had studied cases of people who had apparently died but revived and had these stories of where they went. And that was just fascinating to me, but I didn't put it together that it had anything to do about the modern world. But in 1965, 3 years later, I heard that right there at the University of Virginia was Dr. George Richey, who was a professor of psychiatry, and he had had such an experience. So I listened to Dr. Richey talk, and it changed my life. I will say this, that what I got out of that was that George Richey was for real. Now, that was in 1965. Here it is 2018, and I can still say that George Richey was just the finest individual I ever knew in my life, with all of his faults and so on. But so I knew that Dr. Richey was sincere, but I didn't know what to make of this. It struck me that it was the same thing I'd read in Plato 3 years before, but I went on and I got my PhD in philosophy at UVA at the age of 24, which I still think now, there was something terribly wrong with somebody who would have a PhD in philosophy by the age of 24. Really, and then, went on to have some years later, a MD in addition. And I realized at age 74 that I spent my life with my nose in a book and didn't have that much interaction with the emotional world. So, 1969, I got my PhD in philosophy and I moved to East Carolina University and I started teaching philosophy. And just within a matter of weeks, in teaching Plato and talking about this experience that Plato reported, I began to hear this from my students. And then as word spread in the community from my colleagues. So after teaching philosophy for 3 years, I went to medical school. And so throughout that career, I've had this wonderful experience of interviewing all these great people. Now, again, I just didn't know what to make of this. And I always knew that it didn't have anything to do with the oxygen deprivation to the brain. But because my first year in medical school, one of my own medical school professors told me about her experience, an identical experience in which she left her body, not when she was ill or injured, but when her mother was dying, and my professor was trying to resuscitate her mother, but she had this experience. So my professor wasn't ill or injured. There was no oxygen deprivation to her brain. So something else was going on, I realized, but I just didn't know what to make of it. But now I will be honest, because at 74, honest is all you can be, that I have reached the conviction, as it is, or acceptance, that there is a life after death. So what I want to do tonight is I'm going to go through 6 considerations that have brought me to this point of view. Now, I'm saying this because people who read my books and know about my work, they have the right to know what my own personal take on this, so they can evaluate, or it will help them maybe put an evaluation either way on my work. So in all honesty, I have to say that, yeah, I do accept there is. And so this is how I got there. I have no interest in persuading anybody else. Everybody has to go through their own process on this. But I will talk about how I reached this. The first thing that really brought me to a sense that, in effect, that I give up was empathic experiences that medical doctors reported, in which they co-participated with their patient who was dying, who was having a near-death experience. And the impressions of the physicians were that they were actually interacting with the patient during the near-death experience. And really the first one of these I heard was some years ago now. You will learn at my age that years just kind of collapse. It may have been as long as 8 or 9 years ago, quite a time. But I interviewed a wonderful young to me, graphic artist from the West, who was in a horrific car crash. And in the car crash, his wife was killed instantly, and I believe one of his children. And the artist himself lost a leg in this accident and almost died. But he lived and had this powerful experience to talk about, and so he shared it with me. And he was thinking of writing it up, and I encouraged him to do that because artists, that's how we process things, is by creating something. So then some while later, he called me back and he said he had done this great manuscript, which I read. It's a really good book. But then he called me back a while later and he said that he had decided before he published this book that he really should share this with this trauma surgeon who saved his life, because actually often patients don't tell their doctors about these experiences. So he confided to this physician, the surgeon, what had happened to him during the procedure. And so as I gathered, the surgeon, Dr. O'Driscoll, became solemn and acknowledged that during the procedure, he was aware that the patient wasn't going to die because he talked to the patient's wife during the surgery. And then as the word spread about this, the scrub nurse in the procedure spoke up and acknowledged, yeah, well, I didn't see her, but I heard her. And so this was a big shock to me. I mean, it really was a wake-up moment for me, because I am a logician. One of my areas in philosophy was logic and philosophy of language. And the reasoning process is a very important thing to me. And I had the feeling that I had run out of room for thinking of alternate schemes to fit this in. I just didn't know what to say. I went through a real inner, not turmoil exactly, but awakening. And then a few years passed and I went to Italy, and after my lecture on near-death experiences, a very nice tall man came up who identified himself as a surgeon. And in his eyes, I could see that he had been through something which had really changed him. But I didn't know what it was, but he led me back to the back of this auditorium, and he said that some while before he had been doing an elective operative procedure on a fairly young man who was overall in good health. And so there was no thought of any danger to the surgery, but in the event, the patient had a cardiac arrest during the surgery and the surgeon was unable to revive him. So he told me that he was just beside himself thinking, oh my God, how did this happen? And what am I going to say to the family? And just really distressed. And he said at that point, the door of the operating room swung open and a woman came in, raving and yelling and screaming. And he thought at first that she was a psychotic person who had somehow burst into the operating room. And you know how when you're stressed out, you can't make sense of what somebody else is saying. Anyway, I just learned this in the ER when people will come in and they're not injured, but they're just seen a horrible accident. So you're trying to get a sense from them of what happened, but it's all over the place. You can't make sense of it. So that's how this doctor felt like, what is she talking about? So he told me that he literally had to focus in on her face, say, what is this woman saying? And he said he realized she was saying, my husband is not dead. And she said, I was out in the waiting area and my husband came to me and he said that you think he's dead and I should come in here and tell you that he's not dead. So the doctor told me that he doesn't even remember resuming the resuscitation. But he should, sure enough, after a while, that the patient's heart started beating again. And he said he was there in the recovery room when the patient regained consciousness. And he said the first thing the patient said to him was, "Doctor, I was up above my body up there watching you down there, and I could tell you thought I was dead. So I kept trying to tell you, I'm not dead, but you wouldn't hear me. So I went out into the waiting area to see if I could get through to my wife and tell her to come in here and tell you I'm not dead." And I give up. I mean, I just don't know at that point. I have run out of room. I began to think at that point that there is an afterlife, and I'm still adapting to that. I honestly can't tell you, this is going to sound very paradoxical, but hear me out. If you ask me whether I believe that there's life after death, I can't honestly tell you I do, because not having a religion, what people talking about their beliefs, I'm never really very well related to what they're talking about beliefs. As a logician, I can tell you when you say, "I believe that such and such," you're one of the many different expressions of that same format. I know that such and such, I believe that such and such, I suspect that, I assume. Why do we pick out that one belief? I don't get it myself. But I gather that when people say they believe something, it's like it's internalized, right? But I can't tell you this is internalized. To me, it's more like that this has been extruded from me by the situation. Well, what else can you say? And I'm just talking of a couple of cases here of doctors who have empathically participated in the near-death experiences of their patients. What is going on? Okay, so I haven't internalized it. I'm just still astonished by it, but I don't know what else to say. Because once I know all these things, I can't say that there's not an afterlife. And that kind of brings me to the second thing. And that is, as you can imagine, from the fact that I'm a physician and I've been studying this for 50 years, I guess, that I know a lot of medical doctors who are my friends who have had near-death experiences. And they are coming up on our programs. We're all of these people, we're going to have pretty soon, we're going to have Jeff Olson, the artist, and we're going to have Dr. O'Driscoll, the trauma surgeon, who will tell about his experience. He's reached the point now where he's ready to come forward with this. Mm-hmm. And then we will be talking in our first program, actually, with Dr. Eben Alexander, and the neurosurgeon of Harvard, and a wonderful woman, Dr. Mary Neal, who is a orthopedic surgeon in Wyoming. And I ask myself all the time, now I should explain to you that I am an devotee of exercise, but not because I am under the delusion it's going to make me live longer or that we'll lose weight. I don't care. The reason I walk every day, and all my life I've exercised, and the reason is it feels so good, number one, and also if you get hooked like I am, it's a terrible thing if I have to miss even a day. I get shaky. So what I'm saying here, I am really completely dependent in a way on my exercise. All right, now, and I even hate to say these words, but let's say, for example, that something happened to me in my exercise or whatever, that heaven forbid I had to go to a doctor, which I don't like to go to doctors, okay? And because I've been on the other side of that and I've known how that happens. All right, I just don't go to doctors unless it's really necessary. But I asked myself, for example, if I had a surgery that I needed to do, would I go to my friend Dr. Eben Alexander or my friend Dr. Mary Neal to get surgery? And I say, yeah, well, absolutely I would. I mean, I would put myself in their hands. Absolutely. I trust their medical judgment completely. Well, now, then, on the other side of that, there is the fact that Eben Alexander, as many of you know, in November of 2008, developed a horrific infection, E. coli meningitis, which is almost unheard of in adults and is almost invariably fatal. I've seen some cases of that, rarely, but I mean, I never saw one where the person lived. And yet, not only did Eben live, but all of the people I know who knew him before say he's better than ever. And it's almost like a supernatural energy that comes from Eben. And that here is a man who is a 15-year stint at Harvard as a neurosurgeon and very renowned scholar, was completely convinced by what we call the epiphenomenalist model of the connection between the body and the mind. What is the connection between the immaterial mind and the physical substance of the body? Well, that's a tough one. And the real answer is we don't know. But there's a lot of young people who want to think they know. And so they get into neurosciences. And they begin to think that there's no independent reality to consciousness, that consciousness is just the secondary, unreal byproduct of what they regard as the reality, namely the physical substance of the brain and the electrochemical reactions going into it. And so Eben, as many other neuroscientists are, was completely convinced by that philosophical position as it is. That's not a scientific position. That is we don't know. How would you verify it? We don't know really. But that's what they think. And so Eben, from this experience now, is totally transformed and say, yeah, I see that it's not the body. The mind is primary. The primary reality is consciousness. So now, Mary Neal, a wonderful back surgeon and orthopedic surgeon in Wyoming. Her husband is also an orthopedic surgeon. It's a very well-adapted woman with a flock of kids and a really great lady. And some years ago, Mary went down to Chile, I think it was, on a whitewater kayaking trip. And so going over a little height and splashing down in the water, the rush of the water turned the kayak over and pinned it against the rock wall. And so everyone there was trying to turn the boat over to rescue Mary. But from Mary's point of view, she was in a tunnel of light and could look back at her body and could see which ligaments were cracking. I remember she was able to be abstracted enough from her body to look at it and say, oh yeah, now this tendon is breaking and so on. And she could see her body getting blue and was just happily going on toward the light. And then on the earth, meanwhile, these people who were trying to turn the kayak over to rescue her apparently all agreed that as long as they'd been standing there but suddenly a rock rose up from under the water that hadn't been there before. And they were able to hold on to that rock and turn the kayak over. So then they were out in the middle of nowhere, so trying to drag Mary's body up the sides there to try to find a road. They came out to a road where was sitting an ambulance. And so when they went up and they asked the people on the ambulance, what are you doing here? The guy said, waiting for you. They hadn't made any calls. So they got Mary to the hospital And she lived. Now, again, I want to go back to this. And by the way, Evan is coming soon. He'll be our first program is with Evan and Karen Newell. And then Mary is coming for a program too. We'll talk with her about her experience. But I look at Evan and Mary and I say, back to my question, as a physician, would I submit myself to them if I had a medical need? Absolutely. I trust their medical judgment completely. And so do I trust the medical judgment of many of my other physician friends who've had near-death experiences. And their unanimous opinion is, yeah, this is real. So I don't know what else to say, except it strikes me as a disconnect. Then I would put my life in their hands to trust their surgical judgment or their medical judgment. And yet that I could question their unanimous opinion that what they experienced in their near-death experience was the reality. And what we're going through now is a kind of dreamlike state that is secondary to that real world. And this is, I know as a logician, I have to say, yeah, this is an appeal to authority, which is sometimes a good argument, sometimes a bad argument. And so I'm not saying that trying to propel this as a logical conclusion, but I'm saying I don't know what else to say. I would convict myself of inconsistency in a way if I didn't get these two things reconciled. Well, then another person I can put in that same category is Dr. Anthony Jakoria, who was professor of orthopedic surgery at New York University. He also has a PhD in physiology. He's an MD and a distinguished professor of orthopedic surgery. And I could say the same thing about Anthony. He had a powerful near-death experience. Would I put myself in, when I turn my foot over to Anthony for surgery? Absolutely, yes. Well, now, this is what happened with Anthony makes it even more obvious, something I have known for some years, that, and this is the third thing that has brought me to this point of view, is that near-death experiences inspire creativity in a really extraordinary way. Let me talk about what happened to Anthony Jakoria. In 1996, Anthony was, I believe, at a family reunion. I believe that's what was going on. But at any rate, he was in a phone booth and talking on the phone. And for you younger people in the audience, my phone booth was this little box. And had a phone, put a quarter in. But so Anthony, when he was talking on the phone, got struck in the neck by a bolt of lightning, which exited by his ankle. And it just happened that the next person in line at the phone booth was a nurse who saw that his heart had stopped beating and revived him. And so Anthony said that when he came to, he said, "I'm a doctor." So he refused to go to the hospital, but had this very profound near-death experience, which he's described very beautifully. And then after this, even though he had never been interested in music before, he suddenly became fascinated by the piano. And in the midst of all this kind of, am I going crazy or what? Why am I interested in the piano? A friend of his who was going to be moving away from town for a year said, "Is it possible I could store my piano at your house for a year?" And so he started taking piano lessons. What woke him up to this was he kept having this recurrent dream in which he was playing the piano, the same piece of music, on a concert stage. So then he learned how to transcribe music so he could transcribe this piece. And to make a long story short, Anthony, who is a distinguished professor of orthopedic surgery, is also now an accomplished concert pianist. Now, there are quite a lot of people who have been inspired to artistic creativity that they never knew they had before by a near-death experience. Years ago, I met in Toronto this wonderful woman who brought her big zipper case of art to me to the lecture, and she showed me her art, which was wonderful. And she identified herself as an award-winning artist who's made major prizes for her work. And she said, yeah, well, I never was an artist, but then I had this near-death experience and I came back with this talent. Another really interesting person along those lines is Kevin Fortune, who is the composer of The Hearts of Space, is the name of his music. I tell you, I mean, I'm not so good on The Hearts of Space because I was a forensic psychiatrist. I know a lot about minds of space, but not so much hearts of space. But Kevin is a really great guy who had a near-death experience and then became this phenomenal composer. And so on one of our programs coming up soon, we're going to have Dr. Anthony Jakoria himself, this wonderful man. Oh, just what a great guy. You'll love him. And Kevin Fortune will be with us on that same program to talk about the people who are inspired to great creative production by their near-death experiences. Another one we're going to be talking with soon. This is not scheduled yet, but David Ditchfield is a phenomenal composer who's gained fame and performer in Britain. And the reason he became a musician is that he was one day innocently trying to step on the train, but his coat got caught in the train and he was dragged underneath the train and run over by the train. And I don't know about people listening, but there must be a lot of people listening to this who, like me, are terrified by that image. When I was 16 years old, I remember reading Freud because I got interested in him very early. And I was reading this account he gave about when he was a child in arms. He was in the train station and he saw the train coming in and he felt that unconscious urge, that we all feel probably there. It's, you feel that tug. And he said he felt his mother do that, like the unconscious urge to get in front of the train. And I remember to this moment the anxiety, the shudder that went down my spine when I heard that story, because this image of being swept under the train is so primeval. So David Ditchfield survived getting under the train and is now an eminent musician because of it. So that's the third thing then. It's what do we make of this creativity that comes from near-death experiences? Well, it depends on your view of creativity, I suppose, but my view of creativity is distinctly Greek, in the sense that I remember as a kid studying the Greeks and learning about the muses. And even at that point, it seemed to me that, the muses, I don't know any better explanation of creativity, because I've talked about this with hundreds of artists and writers, and those listening right now will agree that when you create something, it's not like you feel like you're making it up. It's more like you cut off a switch and something comes from somewhere else. And that's how it feels, isn't it? And when you feel like you're composing it, it's never very good. But if you switch off that switch and it just comes through, then it's good. And so creativity seems to come from elsewhere. It always has seemed to me to be. Just a couple of days ago, I had this experience. The news came over about the the packages that were sent through the mail to the various Democratic politicians by them. And so when it came over, I said to my wife, I said, this man is in his 50s. And I was almost getting ready. I heard 56. I was this woman is, but I didn't go with the 56. I almost did, but this man is in his 50s. But I heard it's 56. And then I said, and also it'll turn out he'll have a homosexual problem. And all of those things happen. Well, was that psychic? No. It's just from having worked with mass murderers, and that was my daily work for quite a while, was talking with paranoid schizophrenic murderers and mass murderers and serial killers every day in a forensic unit. And so where did that come from, though? I mean, that's it's your experience leads you only to a certain point, but that experience was remarkable. But I could see where it came from all of these all of this experience and talking with killers. I can see where that generated. But my comedy, I was a comedian for a while, and where that comes from is somewhere else. It's different. It's different from that kind of clinical judgment you make. There's something that is not of this realm that is in creativity, and that is a conviction of mine, that it is somehow there's some bridge to some other dimension that you can access in the creative arena. So, I don't know, I can't fit together in my mind any way to put together this link with creativity than just assume that a near-death experience is an interdimensional experience. I have come to accept that it is. So that's number 3, but number 4, another thing that has brought me to this point of accepting there is a near-death experience is a reaction to the near-death experiences of children. Now, what we hear all the time is, these stories of the kids have got to be more valid because these kids are too young to have absorbed religious training. And I don't buy that. I mean, there's a church everywhere. I mean, people are going to absorb this. So to me, it's the fact that kids have them is impressive, but what impresses me is not that their immunity from religious background. I don't buy that. There's another thing about talking with near-death experiences of kids that has brought me around to this, and that is that there is this amazing sense of maturity that they have that is almost preternatural. I remember this in about 1983. My son was, I guess, then in the 4th or 5th grade, and the teacher asked me to come to talk to the class about near-death experiences because one of the kids in the class had a near-death experience. She was this very sweet little blonde girl with rosy cheeks and very nice. And I sat there and talked with this child about her near-death experience. And I was going through in my mind thinking, how old would I assume this person to be if I wasn't seeing her there and knowing she was a little child? But just listening to her stream of talk and the way she put things, I felt I was talking with somebody in the prime of life, maybe like a very wise person in their 30s. And I mentioned that particular case because that was where it first came to my mind so dramatically. But I had seen this many times with kids. kids that I interviewed who had near-death experiences just seemed to be far beyond their years in terms of understanding and maturity. It was like, one of the things you have to be very careful to watch as a psychiatrist is you have to know all about the phases of human development, like how people develop from infancy to toddlerhood through pubescent through adolescence, the whole bit. You have to know that. And so, I mean, you just get used to attuning yourself to that, like where somebody is in the development. And this is an uncanny experience you have with kids who've had near-death experiences, that it's like their maturity has been catapulted ahead by a couple of decades or something. And so that too has made me feel and give confidence in my assessment that there is an afterlife. Now, the physician who more than anybody else brought attention to the near-death experiences of kids is Dr. Melvin Morris. And Dr. Morris is also going to be on one of our forthcoming programs to talk about his experiences with the near-death experiences of kids. And I have known Melvin since 1988, and I've witnessed a lot of this process that he has gone through in trying to come to terms with these experiences, because I've observed over the years, it's generally harder for medical doctors to come to terms with these experiences than it is for a philosophy person, for example, because I didn't come into this through the medical world. I came into this through the philosophical world. And in the real world, the question of life after death is not yet a scientific question. That's not to say anything bad about the question. What I would say about this question is the question of life after death is the most important question of human existence. Everything else sort of pivots on it, right? So it's a very important question. But to say in 2018 that it is a scientific question is not accurate. And anybody who tells you that, it's too simplified to say that, because we don't have any clear verifiable way yet to confirm or disconfirm this sentence, there's a life after death. So it's not yet a scientific question, but it's a very important philosophical question. And so I think that maybe that gave me some sort of advantage in thinking about these near-death experiences, that I went into it from a philosophical framework. Because if you start bringing the scientific model to this thinking, it goes astray. But for now, it's a philosophical question. But it is entered out into the medical community in a way that can't be denied. This is a reality. A high percentage of people that we resuscitate from cardiac arrest tell us that they went to another world and the interlude, and that they tell us the same thing. And so we've got to come to terms with this as physicians, and it's very difficult to put into the scientific framework now. So now the fifth reason that has brought me to this acceptance of the reality of an afterlife is that I've come to realize that life after death fits into the larger cultural framework that makes us human beings. And that is very important when you realize that all over the world, there has been a cultural understanding that humans are trans-dimensional beings. And that what I mean by that is that when we die, when humans die, we go into some other world. And the various kinds of experiences that come about from a close call with death, like an near-death experience or a shared death experience, which is the same phenomenon, but it happens not to somebody who almost dies, but rather to somebody who happens to be standing there when somebody else dies, and the bystander has a feeling of going into another world. They may leave their bodies along with the dying person and go toward this light, and then come back and are rejoined to their bodies. So these kinds of experiences are just part of human nature. They are recorded all over the world. And so from time immemorial, human beings have believed or accepted or put forward that they pertain not just to this physical world, but to some other world. And the older I get, the more obvious that comes to me, because near-death experiences and shared death experiences are not the only ways that people have to dip into some other world. And I can say this confidently now because I know from experience that lots of people listening to this will understand exactly what I say when I say that I have been to myself into what appears to be other worlds. And I've heard from so many other people who are walking around every day, functional, who have had some experience of being in some other reality. A lot of this dawned on me in connection with my two adopted children. My wife and I have two wonderful grown sons, and they are on their own. And then I have a wonderful grandson, and he's got his parents. And then I have these two kids adopted at birth who are now 17 and 20. Carter is Mexican-American by heritage. We adopted him from Texas. And Carol Ann, who is 17, is a Native American Blackfeet Indian from Montana, again adopted at birth. And you can imagine I was in my 50s when these kids came along, and you're just naturally more observant. And another thing I should tell you, that even though I'm known for speculation about life after death, home life has nothing to do with life after death. Home life is what's for dinner. Let's help with the homework. Okay. What's on at the movies this weekend? Okay. That's our life. And we also don't take these kids to religious ceremonies. And we just don't talk about life after death. But both of my adopted kids at a certain point brought it up themselves. And Carter, now 20, when he was 5, we were sitting on the bed, lying on the bed, and I was flipping through the channels of the TV, and I flipped through what turned out to be the National Geographic channel. But when I did, Carter became very animated. And he said, Dad, that's my village. Well, I flipped it back, and it was a documentary about village life in China. And so Carter, in a very authoritative voice, sort of saying, yeah, you remember, it's like, because he could tell I looked baffled, and he said, yeah, you remember, it's like, before I came to you and Mommy, I was with my other Mommy and Daddy and brothers and sisters in China. And I was just startled. Now, to insert something, we had made a joke, my wife and I, that when Carter's first sounds, when he was just, trying to talk or say something, sounded Chinese to us. We just thought, oh, this is funny. It's like he sounds Chinese. So then 5 years old, he said, yeah. He said, you remember? He said, and then he could tell that I was baffled, that I didn't remember about his other brothers and sisters and mom and dad in China. So as though to orient me, he said, yeah. And then I was up in the trees looking down at you and mom lying in the grass. And I knew exactly what he was talking about, because in 1993, 5 years before we made the arrangement to adopt Carter, my wife and I were in Greece at an archaeological site, and we were exhausted from the travel. So the attendant at the site said, just go over there and lie down in the grass and take a nap. And there were these big trees all around. And what we were talking about in a very deep way was adopting a baby. Well, then the years went by, and we had been trying to, trying to get an adopted baby. Nothing would happen. But I remember my wife one day sort of giving up. I saw her give up, and she said, it's not going to happen. Then, as you can imagine, then a couple of days later, our assistant, Linda, this was October of 97. Our assistant, Linda, came from the yard, and she said, well, the baby is on its way. What? And she said, yeah. I was out there, and I heard the school bus stop in front of the house. And she said, I felt the little boy get off. And then I turned around, and I realized there was no bus there. And that was October of 98. Several months later, in April of 97, in April of 98 was when we made the contact with the family in Texas and went down there to get to know them. Then we were there for Carter's birth on July 20th, 1998. And so that was a wake-up call to me when Carter started talking like this, that I didn't know how to get out of it. It was, see, Carter was born on July 20th, 1998. That was 9 months from the time where Linda heard the bus stop. And by the way, that was the very place where Carter would get off the bus, at that very spot years later when he started going to school. And then, in terms of my Native American daughter, it just was some years ago, 8, 9 years ago, we were doing our daily walk, and just out of nowhere, there's this old wooden bridge. She would like to stop and talk there. And so sitting on the bridge talking, she just all of a sudden said, I don't like this place. And it was obvious she was talking about the world. And as a psychiatrist, your training really gets to you, you learn not to react. I mean, you just sort of, and so, but, and she then went on and she said, yeah. And she said, when you die, you just go up and you be with God, and he keeps you up there till all the people you know while you are alive have died, and then he sends you back as another person. And I said, well, what makes you think that? And she said, just like this, she said, I just know in my mind. And she said, and I was with God, and he pointed you out to me, she said. And she said, you got to go down and be his daughter. And I said, well, how did you feel about that? And she said, oh, I didn't want to do it. She said, I wanted to stay with my Gotti, but she said, he pushed me, just like this now, to be your daughter. And I said, well, are you glad you came anyway? And she said, oh, yeah. Now, because my wife and I don't question them, if you question them, you would be thinking you were shaping the story. But because of that, they still talk about this once in a while. And so I accept the words of my kids that, yeah, there is an afterlife. Now, in that cultural connection, we often hear people say that they had profound experiences under the influence of ayahuasca or other kind of substances. And I don't know much about this. So soon we are having a wonderful expert on this who is going to talk with us about her research with ayahuasca, and which is something I don't know about. So, just a wonderful person, and she's written a wonderful book. Dr. Rachel Harris will be with us to talk about the possible relationships of these near-death experiences to the ayahuasca and other psychoactive substances. I'm going to learn a lot from this one. Now, there is one other, the sixth consideration that has brought me to back. None of these things would have sufficed to make me go ahead and just say, yeah, I give up. There's an afterlife. None of them together even would have brought me to this situation unless I had a logical structure in the background for this. Because, I take this question of life after death seriously. I think there are many people who they even talk about it, but to them, I don't think they're really very serious about it, because they don't really bear down on the severe logical difficulties with this and face up to the fact that this is just not a question that's going to be resolved in any simple way. This is a very big and important question. And the real question, when it gets down to it, if you really analyze it as a rational problem, not as something you would like to be, or a story or whatever, but if you analyze it as a rational problem, everybody gets to the same crunch point, which was stated very brilliantly by David Hume, who lived from 1711 to 1776, who said, if you think these words through as I say them, you'll see that he was right. He said, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. Some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. And that is the real deal. The fact is, the logical code that we have is not consistent with the idea of life after death. That's the fact, no matter whether people want it to be or not. And it has always been regarded as an impossible difficulty to get through. What I want to announce here and now, happily, is that David Hume's problem has been solved. And I have worked out since beginning in about 1968 or so, actually, but it's been published now in France and will be published in the United States soon, where I have worked out the logical difficulties that open entirely new pathways to the genuine rational investigation of life after death. We now have really ways that are not objectionable to any rational person, that we can really grapple with this question. And in a future course here at the University of Heaven, we're going to offer that to you, so exercises and everything, so we can actually reformat our minds to think logically about this big question. So those are my 6 reasons for saying there's an afterlife, and I'm not trying to convince you. On November the 13th, please join us. I hope you'll join me with my friends and colleagues, Dr. Eben Alexander and Karen Newell. We're going to be talking about Eben's phenomenal visit to the other side and some of the ways that this has changed him. So they will be discussing their wonderful new book, Living in a Mindful Universe. And so please join us. We're just going to have a really great time. And so,
Raymond, we have some questions.
And I know that and thank you for your questions that you've been sending through. This is my favorite part, to talk about questions you have. So thank you.
So I'm going to ask them to you, and then you can peep into the audience.
By the way, I want to say there's an offstage character here, my dear friend and colleague, Lisa Smart, who is really the brains behind this whole operation. And she's done this amazing work on the dying words of people, this wonderful book, Words at the Threshold. And we're going to be, soon she will be talking about her work too. So, and Lisa is going to read me some questions, which I thank you so much for writing in these questions. So.
Could the creativity be brought on by damage to the left side of the brain, forcing the right side to become more dominant? Many repeated. Yes.
Could this creativity that comes be brought about by some impairment of the left side of the brain due to the experience, which then liberated the right side to do its things? Well, you know, I'm not competent to ask that. I mean, I have studied neurosciences. I mean, this is something I keep up with and I'm very interested. But my main take on this is still philosophical. I think that the mind is something other than the brain. And even when I was a very young kid, I realized that I am completely confident that I'm conscious now. But that when I try to think of the proof of an external physical world, I give up. Because all I really have is recurrent patterns in my consciousness. And from those, I infer that there is an external physical world. But I may be wrong in my inference. I realized that when I was 7 or 8 years old, that the primary reality is consciousness. And I am just not in a position yet to know whether I've handled brains. I've had to dissect them. I'm aware of that dimension of experience, but the bigger question of whether consciousness has a physical reality attached to it or whether the apparent physical reality of it is just a projection and an explanation we use for the patterns, I don't know. I can easily imagine that that conscious reality has some other generating force than an external physical world, and that is like a systematic illusion. So I don't know, but I mean, it's something is happening where people who have a near-death experience sometimes get in touch with what I gather is a muse. And, you know, as crazy as it sounds, I'm sure a lot of creative people are listening to this who are saying right on that you do have a kind of muse. I've had experiences where my muse just took over and started moving my hand across the page to write something. So thank you for that question. And I'm sorry I have to say I don't really know, but it's a great suggestion.
Another question, very different. I've wondered if any people who've had near-death experiences have also had extraterrestrial encounters.
You know, that's an interesting question, and a friend of mine is actively investigating that. The one that I can remember most vividly that brings that to my attention is that of Dr. George Richey, who was this first living person I heard this from. He was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, and in December of 1943, when he was a recruit in the Army at Camp Barkley, Texas, George, who was then 20 years old, was pronounced dead of double lobar pneumonia. They don't know how long he had been apparently dead when the ward boy found him in the bed, but it is well known that he was pronounced dead once and the death certificate written, but then the ward boy just couldn't face it that this is the first person he had ever seen of his own age die. And so he just begged the doctor, Dr. Francie, with whom I talked about this. And Dr. Francie told me, he said, I've practiced medicine for 50 years. I've never seen anything like George Richey. He said, it was the most amazing experience he'd ever had as a doctor. But George saw all these different realms of the afterlife. And he said he saw this one realm which consists, he said, of like an institution of higher learning. And he said, if you try to imagine Caltech and MIT and the University of Virginia and Yale and Harvard and all of them just squeezed into one, he said, you can't even get a vague idea about what this place is like. But he said he became aware of this one area of this institution, which was like a library. And he said there was one aspect or zone of the library that consisted of the holy books of the universe. So George definitely had a feeling that, the larger cosmos is linked up to this one. And some active research is going on about that now. It'll be interesting to see how that comes out.
Hi, everyone.
This is Lisa.
Hello, I'm Lisa Smart, and there are many questions we didn't get to, and we will get to them in our blog. We will answer them by video and writing. So all the questions that didn't get addressed will be coming to you in the next issue of Ask Raymond in about 3 weeks. So thank you so much for all of those questions.
Yes, thank you for those questions. Because the questions people have asked me over the years have really made me think about this and have shaped my views. Thank you. Bye-bye. I'm just so happy to have this wonderful experience, and thank you so much for watching in. Hope to see you again.